How are you doing? Good. You remember this approval for this. I thought it was necessary here. We can take over to April. Pretty sure. Yeah, there's another one where it's up in the states. To the city council. I talked to him today. Yeah.
Hi, Lori. How are you? Good.
Hi, James. How you doing? Good to see you again.
I started sneezing, so I got out. I was going to say that from the airport.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. Oh, it's the surgery.
Normal.
They'd rather have lay persons that know nothing about anything aviation to give a different perspective.
Yeah.
Which maybe I should be on like an electrical board. I know that crap goes downhill. Yeah, and payday's Friday. Yeah, that's all I know about plumbing. Yeah.
Yeah, I told him I tried calling him to tell him congrats, but I started sneezing and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't be on hold sneezing. So I hung up. Tis the season. Allergies.
What do you do?
Yeah, pop Claritin.
Plenty.
Yeah, no kidding.
I live on Zyrtec this time of year.
Yeah, I need Claritin too, but now it's hard to get Claritin, so I tried the Walgreens generic stuff.
There you go. Good luck with that.
I used to go into the office and he was there for a while. And I went to the booster last night. I was in the network there. Yeah, yeah. And the networking there was my daughter's dance coach.
Yeah.
And
Jared?
and I said some of the dance team parents and they were, oh, where do you guys live?
Yeah.
So
Hey, sorry. Sound isn't on this, is it? Oh, well, yeah.
We are.
Call the meeting to order. This This meeting was publicized by notice in the Fremont Tribune, the agenda displayed in the lobby of the municipal building and posted online at www.fremontne.gov in accordance with the Nebraska Open Meetings Act, copy of which is posted continually in the council chambers for public inspection, and said meeting is open to the public. Copy of the agenda was also kept continually current and available to the public in the principal office of the Department of Planning, 400 East Military Avenue. Planning Commission reserves the right to adjust the order of items on this agenda. Roll call.
We have 7 members present. Oh. He's pretending not to be here. All right, let's do your vote again. There we go, 7 members present.
Okay. Roll call city council.
No, that's the next meeting.
Why is it up on my, oh, because I scrolled ahead too far. Okay. Item number 3, dispense with the reading and approve the minutes of the July 18th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting minutes as prepared. Motion by Sawyer.
Second.
Second by Landholm.
Please vote.
And okay.
And motion carries 8-0.
Make a motion to acknowledge that Nielsen.
We don't need a motion, just acknowledge.
Okay. And just acknowledge that Commissioner Nielsen has arrived just in the nick of time. Item number 4, we'll have a presentation by Jackie Wells. Oh, I did it again.
Yet again.
Item number 4, a request by Dale Natras for a special exemption to allow chain link fencing in the front yard of property generally located at 105 South Morrill Street, Fremont, Nebraska. Staff report.
This is a request to allow chain link fencing in the front yard of a property at the southwest corner of West First and South Morrill. We've recently passed language that allows this to occur, provided that the chain link fencing doesn't undermine the implementation of a plan, which it does not. It needs to be compatible with the surrounding area. And if you look at the pictures that have been included in your packet, the property across the street to the east has a chain link fence around it in the front yard, as does the property to the north, and the property to the northwest actually has a wire fence around it. So it would be compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. And the proposed fence will adequately protect the public health and safety. The property is in a floodplain, but the chain link will allow the floodwaters to pass through in the event that it's flooded. Staff recommends approval.
Does anyone here wish to speak on behalf of this item?
Mark Jensen, 644 West Military. I'm familiar with this property. This property is within my ward. And as stated there, it will be completely compatible with what's already in the area. It's going to improve the property without any detriment to the properties around it. I just ask for approval of this.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I'll close public comments and open up to commission discussion recommendation.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion, we approve.
Commissioner Nielsen, motion to approve. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Carlson.
Please vote. Motion carries. Motion carries 8-0.
Item number 5, a request by Dave Mitchell on behalf of Kevin and Lori Yount for a change of zone from R rural to GI general industrial on property generally located at 602 East County Road T, Fremont, Nebraska. Staff report.
This is a request for a change of zone to industrial. The property is within the city limits. It was annexed as part of the items, processes that took place with the blight and redevelopment study. The area to the northeast is zoned planned development and had been planned for a cold storage facility. The comprehensive plan shows this area as industrial. The updated comprehensive plan shows the area as industrial. The applicant intends to extend a road spur and have a transfer point for a recycling station. It is consistent with the comp plan. The gas department did note that there is a high pressure gas line along the property line. And so that will need to be put into a sleeve and lowered prior to the installation of a road spur. The water wastewater department noted that it is adjacent to sanitary sewer service, and so connection to that is required. However, they do support the use of a well for water, given that the water line is more than 300 feet from, the property is more than 300 feet from a water main. Staff recommends approval.
Is anyone here that wishes to speak on this item?
Sure. David Mitchell, 81 West Fifth Street, Fremont, Nebraska, here on behalf of Kevin and Lori Yant. I believe the application is fairly straightforward, so if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address those. Otherwise, we would respectfully request that you recommend approval.
I have one question. So there's going to be a siding coming to the property from the B&N Railroad, I understand. Is that correct?
If all of our stars line up correctly, yes.
So that siding that you're proposing then, does that have a switch that's added to the rail that's actually coming to the building on the west side? And where do you actually have the siding going?
I understand as the rail track comes around the bend and down toward the property, that their intention is to add a second one that runs parallel with that. And how it's switched out.
On the west side of the property?
West side of the
On
property.
the west side of the property then?
Correct. Correct.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dave.
You bet.
Anyone else? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone else wish to speak on
And
this?
just to clarify, Yant's own property on the west, and it is serviced by a spur, and so they're running right along that same one, so they can get to the same one from the other side. Only it'll be a longer spur, so they can accommodate, I think, about 6 additional rail cars, plus or minus.
Yeah, the reason why I'm asking, I'm familiar with that building because I used to work in the old one out there years ago, it was Liquid Feed Commodities. And I knew there was a rail siding next to that property along with another one to the east, which serves the property across the road to the south then. So I just assumed that we would parallel right with the other
Yes.
2 sets of tracks then. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else wish to speak on this? Okay, I'll close public comment, open it up to commission discussion recommendation. I do have one thing just in the notes, Jennifer. It says approximately 10.98 square feet.
That should be acres.
Square acres. Okay, so let the record show that should be square acres instead of square feet.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve with the change of the acres. Change of square feet to acres.
Motion by Nielsen,
I'll second that.
second by Landholm.
Please vote. Motion carries. Who missed? Who did we miss? Oh, Zach. Okay. All right, so let's do that again. Okay. Motion carries 8-0.
Okay, I need a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Motion by Landholm, second by Sawyer.
All right, please vote. All right, motion carries 8-0. We're adjourned until 5:30 when we'll reconvene at the table.
That's fine. Okay. That explains why it's not on my calendar. See you later.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, the lunch hour to go over
Streaming
the
PC was on camera the whole time.
Okay.
We presented that to the council and the planning commission and the steering committee back in June.
Okay.
So if you are available to join that meeting.
Yes, yeah, we are.
Yeah, please email Jennifer and she can get you all the details.
As I understand it, you're recommending no outdoor advertising on the bypass at all.
Oh,
They're nothing.
really?
I was home, I got out of surgery, takes 20 minutes. I got 11:30 and I was home from home. It's unbelievable. And I think it's pretty much. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's just where they go. And
Oh,
that's,
really?
that's all.
It's when your arm instead of your leg?
That's when you get out. When you're growing, you're gonna lay still. You can't stop it.
Oh.
You know, and so what they do here, if they put a deal, looks like an Apple Watch. Over it, and they blow it up, and it puts pressure on it. And for 4 or 5 hours, then you come in and let off a little pressure. It's to stop it from leaking. And once you do that,
Pretty good, huh?
you're good.
That's pretty cool.
It is. So I hope I feel better after all the it's terrible to be on the blood thinner pills all the time, but I think the way they talk, I'll get off of it. About 2 months.
That's good.
Yeah.
Step here a sec. Up and interject when I need to.
All right, time is 5:30. We'll go ahead and call the special joint city council and planning commission meeting to order. The Opens Meeting Act is posted on the rear wall next to the agendas. So first we'll do the roll call for the city council.
Gibson. Ellis.
Here.
Vaughn.
Here.
Ganem. Yerger. Jensen.
Here.
Sukram. Here. Legman. Here. 5 council members are present here.
Okay, now the planning commission.
Warsaw.
Here.
Jaeger.
Here.
Four Eyes.
Here.
Sawyer.
Here.
Nielsen.
Here.
Carlson.
Here.
Lathrop.
Here.
Landholm.
Here.
8 planning commissioners are present.
All right, item 4 on the agenda tonight is a presentation by Jackie Wells regarding our UDC. So we have Jackie Wells with House Sale Levine, who's here, who's been with this process in regards to our UDC update from the beginning. And so we're gonna get an update from her on where we're at today. So Jackie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mayor, and thank you all so much for having us again this evening. So today we're going to be going over Articles 8 and 9. So that's the planned unit development standards and procedures and the subdivision standards and procedures. So those are Article 8 and 9. So as you'll see in our proposed structure here, we're really getting towards the end of the document. So after this, we just have the last 3 sections left. So zoning procedures, nonconformities, and definitions. So we're getting close. So getting into the plan development standards and procedures. So based on our conversations with you all way at the beginning of the process, we understood that your current plan development process isn't working very well for the city. I could really use some improvements. So we are proposing to completely revamp your plan development process, throw out your current one and replace it with a new process that we hope works better for the city. So first, what is a plan development? So it's a process that provides an applicant, a developer, with flexibility from the application of the zoning standards of a district, so in the strict interpretation of those standards, in exchange for tangible benefits to the community. So really a negotiation between the developer, the applicant, and the city, the Plan Commission and the City Council, you all. So the purpose of this process is to promote long-term planning, so ensure that development in the community is aligned with adopted plans and policies, like the new comprehensive plan, to stimulate and accommodate creative approaches to development, provide more efficient use of land, help to preserve natural features and provide open space in excess of what might otherwise be required in the ordinance, develop new approaches to the living environment, and unified buildings and sites through design. So we are in our process that we are proposing, the plan development would be applied as an overlay. So the base district designation that would remain. So if I'm in a suburban residential zoning district, those standards would remain, and I would be requesting deviations from those standards. So the modifications to the standards of the base district would be referred to as site development allowances. So if I want lots that are smaller than what is required, that would be a site development allowance that I would need to request in my application. So I'd identify that request, accompany that request by a narrative explaining why I think that would be compatible with surrounding development and would be necessary for the proper development of the site. And then I would align that request with a modification standard.
Let me interject. I want to interject for a second. The way it's been working under the current UDC is you just have a planned development district. So for example, Gallery 23's planned development, and the zoning is PD planned development, but then they designate on their site plan the areas for commercial use, the areas for residential use, and the areas for multifamily. This change would have something like Gallery 23 have a suburban commercial area and auto urban residential and whatever other residential districts. So you would have those base districts then with a planned development overlay that could allow the adjustments to those base districts.
So how is it different? Other than the wording?
Instead of just an amorphous district that's called planned development, you have specific zoning districts for each part of the development with a planned development overlay.
So the real difference is the deviations from the zoning. So the changes, the flexibility that's being provided is based off of what the standards of that district are. So if I want 5,000 square foot lots rather than the required 7,000 square foot lots in that district, that's a site development allowance that I would need to request as the applicant. And then justify that request with my narrative explaining why that's compatible with surrounding development and necessary for the proper development of the site, and justify it with one of the modification standards. So these are the proposed modification standards. So landscape conservation and visual enhancement. So perhaps there's a large wooded area on the property that I'm proposing to preserve moving forward. And because of that, I need to have smaller lots because they're located in a smaller area of the development, but I still want to have the same number of units in return. Sustainable design, perhaps I use green infrastructure throughout the development. So I'm requesting to have a greater yield on the number of units that are able to be built to kind of offset those costs. Public gathering space, there's maybe it's a commercial plan development and we're proposing to include a public plaza that would provide a nice community gathering area. Placemaking, it would have a very unique sense of place, a real destination in the community. Affordability, so perhaps they're requesting a greater number of units, higher density than what would otherwise be allowed, but some of those units would be deed restricted as affordable to certain members of the community, so they're requesting that additional density to help offset the costs related to that affordability. Similarly with universal design, that would be designed for people that may have mobility issues, so they're able to access those homes or those units. And then high quality building materials, so a higher quality standard for those exterior building cladding materials than you might otherwise be required to use. So those would be all of the things that you would go above and beyond what would otherwise be required in the UDC in exchange for whatever request you're making. So let's say I want greater building height, I would use one of these modification standards to justify that. Perhaps I also want smaller lot area, then I would choose another one of these modification standards to help justify that. So this is where we're getting that a negotiation, those tangible benefits to the city in exchange for this flexibility from the underlying zoning. Is that all making sense? Please.
It does. One thing that I have a question about is if you have like a 40-acre development site that's so residential, you want commercial in there, you have to do these trade-offs for
that as well. They're rezoned in a section as commercial with residential around it. And you have to do trade-offs for landscape conservation, for instance, in order to get that before you even go on to the rest of your plan development.
So with the plan development, let's say it's a big 40-acre piece of land that is currently zoned rural or agriculture, and you want to develop it with a mix of uses, so residential in one component, commercial in another. You would propose that zoning as a part of your plan development, and then if you wanted deviations from that, you'd be able to request that as a part of the process. Or it could be a concurrent process. Yeah. Any other questions on the modification standards? All right. So I would like to hear what you think about these proposed modification standards. Do you think they're hitting the mark? Are they perhaps not the right fit for Fremont? A lot of communities look at other topics to include as modification standards, other goals that the community may have that they would like to reach through this process. Some folks don't think public gathering space should be one of those things. Perhaps that's something that should just be required for a plan development altogether. Or affordability, maybe that's not an appropriate modification standard. Any thoughts on what's being proposed?
I think it looks good, but who's judging that the criteria and trade-offs are equal?
Mm-hmm. So that would be you all, right? So through the approval process, the Plan Commission would have and we'll get into the process, right? So it would go through the Plan Commission for a public hearing and review and recommendation, and then go to the City Council for another public hearing, review and decision making. So then there could be a couple backs and forth. So depending on what the City Council thinks, if perhaps we need additional discussion or conversation, but there would be some additional language, of course, explaining what these different modification standards are, but whether they are met or not would be to the discretion of the Plan Commission and the City Council. All right, so if there are no more thoughts on the modification standards, we'll move into standards for review. So the modification standards, those only apply to site development allowances. So those deviations from the underlying zoning. The standards for review apply to the proposal as a whole. So the entire application would need to meet these various standards for review. So plan and policy alignment, that would be looking at the city's adopted plans and policies. Is it in line with the goals and vision and recommendations of those documents? Understanding that the comprehensive plan, other plans and documents of the city, they are living, breathing documents. So perhaps it's not to the T exactly what the land use plan and the comprehensive plan is envisioning, but it meets the spirit, the vision, the goals of the document. Integrated design with identifiable centers and edges. So the whole point of a plan development is to have a very cohesive, comprehensive master planned site. So the integrated design with identifiable centers and edges, that's really ensuring that the entire development is cohesive and is developed as a whole, planned as a whole, and not sort of a piecemeal phased thing. Public welfare, of course, the whole point of the UDC is to promote and further public safety and welfare. Compatibility with adjacent uses, so want to make sure that whatever it's next to, it's compatible with. Impact on public facilities and resources, so it doesn't have an undue impact on your utilities, on your infrastructure, and if it does if it is going to have that impact, it helps to offset those impacts. And then archaeological, historical, or cultural impact. This would especially be important in your downtown area. How does it further your preservation efforts for your historic areas? Is it impacting any archaeological or cultural resources in the community? So these would be those standards that you would review the entire plan development application against. So any thoughts on these?
Jackie, maybe this is a question for Jennifer, but can you just, I think the goal here is we want to manage the expectations of whoever's coming in, looking at developing a site, if it's 40 acres, right? From start to finish, making sure this part right here, before it gets to the planning commission or the city council, have you essentially vetted it, this part?
Yeah, I would have application meetings with the developers and other department heads, and we would talk about the requirements. This is for a planned development. We're not proposing that every subdivision has to be a planned development, right? It's the overlay when you're asking for something special. That part of it isn't changing. Does that make sense? I mean, we could make it a requirement for everybody. Okay, that's what I thought.
So that's a great segue into the next section. And it is a bit cut off on this board because the screen's not all the way down, but if we look back here, we can see the proposed procedures for the plan development. So we'd start with a pre-application conference. This is before the applicant submits anything to the city officially. So we are proposing that there would be an optional project introduction. So they would have the option of coming in front of your groups and say, this is my idea, and then kind of get a non-binding decision or opinion from you all on whether that is something that would be appropriate or something that you all would consider moving forward. Again, non-binding. If you say, you know, that's a great idea, and then what they propose, you know, in their actual application is way off, that doesn't mean you have to vote yes for it. It just provides sort of a general gist of what the plan commission or the city council is thinking.
I recommended taking that out.
Oh, did you?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
The pre-introduction would be a department head meeting instead of a meeting with the council and planning commission, just to keep the process moving more expediently. So you don't have, that was my recommendation. You might have a different recommendation, but if you had a meeting with the planning commission, then a meeting with the city council, then you went back and did changes and then brought it back and we reviewed it at the staff level and then brought it back to the planning commission and city council. My thought that was that would add an awful lot of time to it. So my recommendation was that we don't have the project introduction with the planning commission, city council, and the public meeting takes place when the application comes forward through the approval process.
Isn't that how you do it today?
That's how we do it today.
Yeah. So
We don't have
that's actually worked then, hasn't it?
Yeah, so we don't have the project introduction. Some communities do that. But it seems to me that in Fremont, we like to move things forward a little bit more quickly, and
We hear a lot about people
So-
saying that our departments here are slow and to get the process moving forward. I agree with you totally.
Yeah, so this is being proposed, and we can certainly revise it per Jennifer's recommendation. But what we are proposing was just an optional meeting. It's something a developer could choose to do if they wanted to. Some communities have this as an option as to allow developers the chance to get in front of the elected and appointed officials, give them an idea of what they're thinking, get a general idea of whether that's something that would be amenable to the community. So before they spend a lot of money doing investing in the property, investing in the application, they could get sort of a sense of what the elected and appointed officials would think.
You just mentioned something, the money side. So if somebody just has a thought and they come to the group here, is that the same way they can come to you, or do you have to see all their details of what they're doing?
generally, there are two things happen when somebody comes to me with an application idea. They either already have things laid out and want feedback on the specifics, or they have just kind of a broad idea and want feedback on how that would be integrated into a plan. So it could just be hey, I've got this idea, I want to do a mixed unit development in this particular area. And I was thinking I would put the commercial here and I would have residential here. What do you think of that? You know, that's very broad. They don't have to have everything.
One way or the other. What we're
Right.
requiring, in other words, without all the expense to go that far.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. But then once they submit an application, we talk about what all is needed with that application in terms of showing us the lot layout, the street layout, where the utilities are going to connect, you know, is water and sewer close available, so on and so forth.
I guess I've taken a couple of meetings. I would call project introduction, just I've taken, I imagine everybody else has too, one-on-one with people, not in a meeting room set that's open. I think just about everybody's taken a few of those meetings.
Sure, but those are informal. It's not part of the formal process. And what this is talking about, the formal process.
So then we'd have the opportunity if there was any concerns with any of the application of requirements not being applicable to that specific development, they would be able to request a waiver, and that waiver would be submitted to the community development director and either approved or denied. And then based on that, they could file their application. So the first step would be meeting with staff, making sure that they understand fully what the requirements of the plan development process are. We'll take out that project introduction and public meeting optional. And then for the application requirements waiver request, they can either submit that request or not. That could either be approved or denied by the community development director. And then after the formal application is filed with the city, there would be a staff report identifying whether it's meeting all of the requirements or not. And then there would be a, go ahead.
One more change. Because of the way we have done things and the desire to have the planning commission and city council approve waivers, my recommendation to Jackie was that I make a recommendation and I let the developer know ahead of time whether I'll recommend approval or denial to the waiver, but the actual approval or denial would come through the process and not be an administrative process.
What you're saying is we get to read your recommendation when it
Correct.
comes to us then.
Correct.
Both council and planning.
Right, correct. I would say, yes, I recommend the waiver for these reasons, or no, I don't recommend the waiver for these reasons. And then the applicant has the opportunity to plead their case with the appointed and elected officials. Just like it currently is. Right. And that way, people aren't appealing my recommendation to the planning commission or city council. You guys are just taking care of it.
And then would that be as a separate meeting where they would request the waiver?
No, it would be all
In-house.
together,
Okay.
all with the application.
Okay. So then the next step after the application is received and determined to be complete, there would be a public hearing, review and recommendation with the plan commission, then a public hearing, review and action by the city council. So we understand that there's 3 readings that currently happen with the city council for plan developments. So we are proposing that there would be an option for the city council if, everyone approves, everyone is on board with the application to not require the 3 readings, so we would just have the one public hearing, review, and then you could approve with modifications or deny, or if you think additional consideration is needed, refer back to the plan commission or postpone until additional information is received.
And state statutes require an ordinance to have 3 readings. So this would just provide you with the option to waive the 2nd and 3rd reading at the council level if you felt that was appropriate. Yeah, Mitch. That's how it is today.
So my question is, what's different from what we're currently doing? It sounds like it's a lot of stuff.
A lot of it is similar, but the mechanism of the plan development is what's working a little bit differently. Instead of just having it be an amorphous district that's a big blob with PD on it, the specific zoning districts on the specific areas of the development will show up with a deeper etched line around it that says PD.
By the time it gets from your approval to planning commission, city council,
The process will be the same, but how the mechanism of implementation is different. It's a little subtle maybe, but you're actually approving. So instead of saying this is a PD that contains these types of development, we're saying this is a PD, this portion of it is zoned commercial, this portion of it is zoned residential, and so forth. So the specific pieces of land will have the zoning, underlying zoning on them with the PD overlaying it.
Is that something a developer might take issue with? I mean, being specifically locked into not having the flexibility, maybe as times change or things change what their plan looks like?
You would still have the same amount of flexibility. You could still come back and amend your planned development and flex things around a little bit, but you have you're showing the puzzle pieces that underlie the overlying PD instead of just showing the PD. And I guess an example I could use is Morningside Point. We went through to change the zoning on the commercial part of that and take that out of the PD because that's how it works right now. You just have that overlay with the PD. The plan specifies what's going to go where, but it doesn't have that underlying zoning. Most communities do it where you have the underlying zoning in place already and then have the plan development overlay. And the purpose of the plan development then is to have some sort of innovative development. So you're doing a cluster subdivision of some sort because you want higher density and smaller lot sizes, but in return, you're going to be preserving a riparian wetland, or you're doing an innovative mixed use development that provides missing middle housing and commercial development, but you want lesser parking requirements because it'll be pedestrian oriented development or something along those lines. A regular, vanilla development would be, I'm going to develop single family lots here and I'm going to develop commercial lots there, and I'm going to meet all the requirements of the underlying zoning. And that's different than a planned development. Does that make sense? Okay.
All right, so our question to you all is what types of development should be eligible to go through the plan development process? So some communities only allow certain types of development to go through a plan development process, and some communities require some types of development to go through the plan development process. So in the communities where they restrict the types of development that is eligible to go through the plan development process, that's typically straight single family detached type of development where it's just a subdivision, nothing really special about it, no real reason why you need that flexibility from the underlying zoning. And then in other communities where they require certain types of development to go through the plan development process, it's often location specific. So perhaps in the downtown or a very specific location in the community that really deserves an extra layer of discretion and review. Sometimes it's development over a certain size. So maybe anything 40 acres or larger, 100 acres or larger, because it has such a possibility to impact the community, the city may want to have that additional discretion. Or if there's a development of a certain type, such as a mixed use development, the city may want to have that additional level of review. So you all have any thoughts on what types of development should be eligible to go through the process, and if any types of development should be required to go through the process?
Anything over a certain size, certainly, but figure out what size that is.
Well, I think it really depends on what our goals as a community are. If we are requiring certain things to go through a plan development, it allows us to elevate standards, but it could also slow down development, and it could also cost the developers more. So, it's kind of a give and take. And what is it that you want to see? You might require new subdivisions in the floodplain to go through the plan development project, because you think that there ought to be a higher level of review for that type of development. Downtown, I think, might be a little difficult if you have each individual building go through a plan development. But if somebody's proposing a new development downtown and you want to make sure it's compatible, that might be something that you want to consider. It is kind of the heart of our community, or in historic districts. If anybody's planning a new development, those are areas where I think you might want to require that higher level of review. Fremont has grown slowly over the years, and there has, at least my experience has been that there's a desire to have development and to make it as easy as possible. So I think it's important for the community to kind of weigh what it is you want. And if you want to have, you know, a few more restrictions, but maybe get a higher end product, you know, that's one thing. Or if at this point, there's just certain areas, or, you know, where you want to focus on that entryways, or like I said, floodplain or downtown, you know, or, you know, only if somebody is asking for a special exception. I think there are valid reasons for any of those decisions. And I think it really has to be a community decision from the decision makers on how you want to balance that.
Some people might get higher density, home is smaller, real small homes for make it even affordable. I just think there's a lot of places to think about. Yes, we need it, but not in my backyard. So we have meetings all the time. Yes, we need it, but not in my backyard.
And we have seen some of that in the recent past. So, and you want to also be really careful because you don't want to require a higher development standard, say for affordable housing, than for any other type of housing, because then you might be viewed as being discriminatory. So there's a fine line to walk there, you know, so maybe it's based on the density of the housing that you might want to have further review, but we already in those areas require the conditional use permit. You know, you can go either way, really, with that. Planned development allows a little bit more flexibility. You know, kind of the purpose, the way it's being set up here is it allows some of that negotiation. But again, it really comes down to what as a community do we want to see and what can we support? And that's the most important thing, is that, you know, whatever regulations we set up and then go to implement, we want to make sure that those are supported by the elected and appointed officials.
Can you give me an example of a certain type of mixed use there on the last line, how that would apply? Here.
Jackie might have a specific example. I'm thinking more like the Prairie Queen development in Papillion. We drove past that,
Okay.
where they have, it's very dense residential housing. They have some commercial uses on the bottom. There's not a single family detached housing unit in the development. It's all either multifamily or row houses. It's all very walkable.
Is that the one where we had the lake?
Yeah, it's by the lake,
Okay.
the one right there by the lake. And so Prairie Queen Lake is an NRD lake in Papillion. This development abuts it. Again, it's very dense, but it's also very walkable. So they have reduced parking requirements. They had reduced lot size requirements. It is the mixed use. They have higher quality building materials. There are things in place to ensure walkability and connections to the park. So that might be an instance where you've got something that's really pretty innovative and different, but you would want to have that higher level of review and go through a plan development process.
Okay. Wouldn't you have to have that anyway? For development such as that, wouldn't that, you know, come before us?
Well, it would have to come before you, yes. But it wouldn't necessarily have to be a planned development. So it's just, it puts an additional layer of review and opportunity for negotiation. And I mean, this is something just to kind of think about. And we don't need an answer tonight, obviously, but I'll see if I can come up with some examples of some developments. Currently today, we don't encourage alleys. The new UDC isn't necessarily encouraging them, but would allow them. An example in Lincoln is Fallbrook development that's off of North First Street. there's a town center and then some new urbanist type houses that the garages are in the back of the house and they take access off a house of an alleyway. The lots are very small, so there's a real small yard, but there's a lot of green space in shared medians and parks in that area. So that's an example of a different type of development that we would want to do through a PUD instead of a straight subdivision.
For instance, if we decided that we want to have stricter standards for those areas, we would discuss what we want those standards to be.
Right, that's kind of the part of this whole process that we're going through with the UDC update. We would want to have those standards identified in the UDC. Right, and those, we would want to identify those areas probably in the comprehensive plan that would say these are areas where we want higher standards because they're entryways to our community, and we're going to require a planned unit development for any development in these areas. And that could be for commercial, it could be for industrial, it could be for residential. So the new bypass might be an area, or coming up 275, you know, saying any new development or redevelopment in these areas, we want to have stricter standards and require a PUD.
Any other thoughts on planned developments? All right, then we'll move into our next article, Article 9, the Subdivision Standards and Procedures. So this is a lengthier section of the UDC, but not a lot has changed from what you all have currently. There are just a couple of major change sections that we wanted to review with you all this evening. So the first one is the street network design. So two changes that we are proposing for this section is first the street stubs. So to require that in a new, mostly residential subdivision, but often non-residential subdivisions as well. Instead of having all of your roads terminate at the boundaries of the subdivision, require that additional or future connections be made. So we'd have a street stub and have a sign there to let residents know that this is a future road extension. So don't get too used to this being a dead end, just to help clarify that message to folks. And then the next recommendation is to improve on-site connectivity. So still allow for the use of cul-de-sacs, but minimize them overall. So through the connectivity index requirement, you would, this would be the way you would measure or quantify the number of connections that would be required. So it's a simple math problem. You take the number of road sections between intersections or leading to cul-de-sacs, and you divide that by the number of intersections. So in this graphic, they're called nodes and links. So the nodes are either the intersections or the cul-de-sacs, and then the links are the roadways in between those. So when you divide that number, you get your connectivity index, and we're proposing a minimum of 1.2, which is about what is being proposed here. So still allowed to have cul-de-sacs, but have greater connectivity overall. And this helps to improve walkability, also helps to improve public safety response times. You can have improved traffic and just generally better connectivity in a community. Any thoughts on street stubs or connectivity?
Is that something that could be amended?
Yes. Yeah, that would be a great one, especially if there's a development in like a floodway or not a floodway, but in a flood prone area. You may not want to have a super connected streetway system or cul-de-sacs because that's just the way you need to design that site. That would be one great way of requesting that type of deviation. All right. So our next topic is street design and improvements. So we've heard through conversations with you all that the right-of-way width and paving width perhaps needs to be looked at again. So we did some review of what other communities in the region, what best practices are for requiring these right-of-way widths and paving widths. So we have the minimum requirements that are proposed here for arterials, collectors, local non-residential and local residential roadways.
Question, we're revising the width of the residential street again. Back to 30, what used to be 32 or 28, and we're going back to 31.
So that's the question. Dave hasn't had an opportunity to review or comment on this at this point. And I think that's really the question for Planning Commission and City Council to look at now and say, do the narrow right-of-ways make sense, or does it need to be wider? We've heard a lot of comments and complaints about the narrower right-of-ways on the 28, but there is also a lot of benefits to having a narrower right-of-way. You have less impervious surface, less development cost, and so forth. So it's a proposal to be considered and some significant thought to be given to it. But I did have a question. You've got the table title is minimum paving width, but then the other is maximum.
Oh, yeah, that should be.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, these are just proposed changes, something for you all to think about, nothing set in stone at this point. But this is in response to some of the feedback that we heard from you all that there perhaps needed to be some changes to this part of the subdivision standards. So in addition to the required right-of-way widths and paving widths, we're proposing that there be some other standards for what needs to be included in a street itself. So some different street design elements, so sidewalks, trails, parkways, bike lanes, shared lanes, also called sharrows, on-street parking and medians. So these different symbols mean whether something is required perhaps on just one side of the street, that's the filled in circle, whether it's just required like the parkway or the bicycle lane, that'd be required on both sides of the street. The square would be as required by the community development director. And then the diamond shaped would be just required in the roadway. You wouldn't need it on both sides of the street. It's a feature that you would just have that one time. So we'd have different options for collectors, non-residential and residential local roads that the developer could choose what's most appropriate for their development. So these are just example diagrams that we've used in other communities to better illustrate the types of things that are being required. So in this community, they had a street verge rather than a parkway that had trees in it as well. So they had the landscape strip on the other side of the sidewalk. What we're proposing would be a combined strip with where you have your utilities and your trees, your street trees. And then in one option, you have on-street parking and a shared bicycle and vehicle lane. In the other option, you have a median and a bike lane, and then the dedicated the vehicle lane. So the developer for this roadway type would be able to choose which option is best suited to their development for their market. Here's just another example of another roadway type where we have the parkway with the trees and the utilities, and then the sidewalk between that and the private property. And again, this is where we have the on-site or on-street parking, and the shared lane. And then the other option is the bike lane and the median. So any thoughts on these required street design elements and the different options or kind of menu of street design elements that a developer could choose from? All right, so our next topic is about cluster development. So this is proposed to be applicable to any residential subdivision that the city may see. If there is a development in the floodway or the flood fringe, they would be required to put all of those applicable lands in the conservation easement. They would be allowed to have changes in the dimensional standards of the district. So in the lot area, lot width, the setbacks, all of that You would have to maintain the same gross density, so the overall number of units wouldn't change, but you would be allowed some tweaks to those dimensional standards because that land is being preserved in a conservation easement. And then if you go above and beyond preserving just what's in the floodway or the flood fringe in a conservation easement, if you put other natural features in an easement, you could get some gross density increases by up to 30%. So you could have a higher density development if you're preserving more land area. Any initial thoughts on cluster development? Dad? All right, then our next topic is anti-monotony standards. So this is proposed for single family and duplex developments. So the proposal here is that 3 houses on either side of the subject property or 5 houses directly across the street from the subject property would not be able to have the exact same design configuration or exterior building cladding materials package. So it wouldn't be a as strict of anti-monotony standards as a lot of other communities have. We're not saying you have to have a pitched roof here and a gable roof here and all these different types of facade standards, but just that you can't have every single house be the exact same house in a subdivision. So some pretty minor requirements. So in this graphic, the 3 yellow boxes, those could all be the exact same house, but all the other ones would need to have some variation or deviation from that.
Yeah, so this is something to really think about. Cookie cutter development is pretty bland and not interesting, but we have a lot of it here in town. DR Horton is developing in Gallery 23, and they have 3 or 4 different specific housing styles that they build, and they get the economies of scale by building that exact same style. We see similarly in Sunridge, those type of developments, Bluestem Commons, where there's a lot of the very similar type of housing. So again, a lot of communities do this to create some visual variation, and it's a great thing to do for urban design. But when we think about, is that what we want in Fremont? And how does that mesh with our goals, for affordable development and more development, and for how developers are developing now and today?
What kind of compounds with things we were talking about earlier, as far as the general quality of what we want to look at when we approve the project? Personally, I'd like to see everything kept up a notch. Fremont right now is suffering from the result of just doing whatever we can to get people in here. And looking forward, Omaha continues to expand. I really think that Fremont's going to become quite attractive in that respect for people who want to move here, even more so than the federal community will where we are. So I would really like to see a lot more variation than what's shown here, and also then take everything up. So push.
Other thoughts, comments?
That's not really asking for much. It's kind of the same design configuration before as you're building cladding material. You can have the exact same plan and change the roof pitch here and different color siding. I mean, I agree. I don't think that it's an impediment. I don't see it as an impediment to development to have that stricter.
Stricter than what's proposed or stricter than what's
Stricter than what's proposed.
Stricter than what's proposed or here? Oh, okay.
Any other thoughts on anti-monotony?
Well, I personally think that if we want, like we said, if we want the community to expand, I think it will give the opportunity to have more opportunity to choose the materials, and I don't think it's a bad thing. We don't have the correct.
So would you all think that greater direction on the types of changes you would need between the homes is warranted, or maybe it's 6 houses on either side of the property and 10 across the street, increasing the number of kind of changes or variations we would be requiring?
Yeah, I don't think so. I had a client who across the street from the house that was the exact same floor plan for 10 years, and then the house across the street came up for sale and walked through it, and that's when they realized it was the same floor plan. It was the exterior cladding was different.
The changes were cosmetic on the outside, excluding.
Yeah,
Right.
They had no idea for 10 years living across the street, and looking at it every day when we walked out the outside. That's fine.
Okay. All right. Then last but not least, we have Parkland Provision. So this is a topic that's been brought up a couple of times. It's something that's been discussed through the comprehensive planning process. And this is just something to consider for the community. So one of those comprehensive plan goals is to ensure that there's sufficient parkland for the community as the community grows. So one way to accomplish this is to require the provision of parkland in new residential subdivisions. So this is a potential approach to doing that. So what is proposed currently, it would be applicable to residential subdivisions when the density is greater than 1 dwelling unit an acre. And then the requirement would be a minimum number of acres to be provided for every 1,000 residents. And the way we would calculate that is by the city's current per 1,000 residents standard. So I'm just pulling this number out of my hat. Let's say it's 10 acres per 1,000 residents in the community. Then they would, let's say your subdivision is projected to have 1,000 residents, you'd be required to provide 10 acres of parkland. And that's just a number that I'm throwing out there. Go ahead.
So now I'll tell you the downside of potentially doing it this way. So we had a lot of conversations about public or private parks. One of the challenges with public parks is our parks department is already stretched really thin and, is struggling to keep up with the maintenance of the parkland that we have today. It can be really expensive to maintain. So Jackie's suggesting that we do private parkland. The challenge with private parkland is that you have a homeowners association and they're paying the dues to maintain the private park. Well, the homeowners association gets tired of taking care of the park and doesn't pay the taxes on it. It goes up for tax sale. And then the person who buys it expects that they're going to be able to develop it. And then it doesn't happen. That's happened to me a couple times in other communities that I worked in. And it creates a struggle, one that certainly can be overcome, but it's a struggle or can be a struggle. The other issue that we run into is it's a private park. How do you restrict use of that private park? And we have a couple parks here in Fremont, where the homeowners association wants to maintain it as a private park and other people want to be able to use it. So that can become a political struggle. Again, something that can easily be overcome, but those are the kind of things that you might want to consider. And then a fee in lieu of, currently we do have that 10% fee on all of our building permits. It helps build up a fund to enhance our community parks. But if there were a fee in lieu of parkland, then the Parks Department could, focus where the parks ought to be or how they maybe ought to be expanded. Or maybe there is a combination of these where you can provide a private park. Or instead of that, we know that there needs to be a park you know, a half mile up the road, we have and we're planning to build one in that area, maybe we have a fee in lieu of. Just different things to consider.
And that's exactly the approach that's being proposed currently, is that the city's planning to build a park, within a short distance of this new subdivision. City council could say, instead of providing the private parkland, pay into this fund to help improve this public park that your residents will benefit from.
The other thing that we need to be careful with, we have two new subdivisions that are in sanitary and improvement districts, Bluestem Commons and Gallery 23. At the point those subdivisions are annexed, all of the parkland that is in those becomes a city asset, just like the streets and everything else. The city takes all the assets and the liabilities. So in a situation like that, a private parkland would be more difficult. We could probably find a way to legally make it work, but that just is another issue.
Not an issue to run a private parkland if there is an injury. I mean, they go after the homeowners association.
Yeah, it would be the responsibility of the homeowners association to carry the liability insurance.
What about maintenance annuity required? That's maybe try that, or city required maintenance annuity for 50 years on the park to.
That's certainly something I think we could consider. But certainly, access to parks is something that's important to the community. It's just how much and where and how we address it.
We've got reactions on whether requiring the provision of parkland in new subdivisions is something that the city should consider.
What do Gretna and Elkhorn, some of those communities, they have parkland provisions like this? Maybe you don't know, I'm not sure.
I do not know off the top of my head, but we could certainly look into that.
Because it may not be far down the road, as that's who we're going to be competing with to get people to come here. We're having parkland provisions, then the builders will say, you know what, I don't have to have these provisions if I go to Gretna or to Elkhorn, or it won't be long to Valley, because I think we're going to be growing that way. So I just want to make sure we're not pricing or digging ourselves in a hole where we're going to be making people pay a lot more for these things.
Oh, Travis, you might have an idea of what they do in the Omaha Sarpy areas. I know Papillion does have some parkland and trail requirements, but they're in Gretna, in Elkhorn is part of Omaha. The areas that are just outside of Omaha as they develop are all developing through the sanitary improvement district process. And through that process, there's pros and cons, but parks usually a GO.
Was that?
Are parks generally a general obligation?
Yeah, through the SID.
Yeah, through the SID.
And Elkhorn, I'm not familiar with, but Gretna is growing a lot through the SID process. And
with what you work on in Sarpy, are there parkland set asides? I know Papillions have those trails.
Bellevue's done a few.
Yeah.
It's popular to build those splash pads now for parks. Papillion, they're going more toward the NRD or the lake type park, where half the land around the lake is a single family, more expensive homes, and the other half is more lower income or middle income type multifamily housing units.
Yeah, and they have trail connections from the residential areas, a lot of times within a green space, not on the sidewalk, that connect to those lake park developments that have trails around those. Again, there's pros and cons. I'm not sure what they're doing around the Elkhorn area, which is all developed through the city of Omaha.
Yeah.
I can look into that. Sure.
Maybe on the flip side of that, Mark, is I know we're kind of park heavy as a city right now, and I just hate to handcuff ourselves in the future.
and not have them.
One of the things we've run into in development and planning is not being able to set aside a piece of ground as a park, especially if the city doesn't own it. We have great problems with flooding, so we need more NRD land. Do we not already as it is? I mean, would it not be beneficial to the city to figure that out and set that aside? Would that kind of make a loophole for that? And is there state or federal funding we can get for doing that?
I'm not sure if there's state funding or federal funding available for acquisition of areas that aren't flooded. There are federal funds that are available for acquisition when an area has flooded to prevent future flooding. The Fremont topography is very different than the Omaha metro area. And the lakes that they have in Papillion and in Omaha are flood control for the Papio Creek. And they have topography where the water runs into it. And we don't, we're flat. So that creates a bit of a challenge. We are working with the county and JEO is doing a study, two studies right now. One is in the Elkhorn Township that is evaluating Rawhide Creek waters to try and get them out of town to minimize flooding. And then the other is trying to minimize the waters from Rawhide Creek coming into town. So there may be opportunities to acquire detention cells in those areas, but those are more likely to probably just be green spaces that you see and not necessarily parkland. But I don't know the details of that at this point. I mean, it's certainly, you could have a soccer field complex that's depressed and gets wet when it rains or not, but it has to be designed obviously for that, and something where you're not going to have big competitions for soccer. You've got to have parks that you expect to get wet and not be able to use when they are wet. It's not an easy issue. That's why they pay you the big bucks, right?
Any other thoughts on Parkland Provision? All right. Any other questions on anything that's been presented this evening? Plan developments or subdivisions? Perhaps anything that wasn't presented that you were hoping to learn more about? All right, well, with that, thank you so much. We appreciate your attention this evening and hope to get some additional comments as you review the text more fully. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Jennifer. All right, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Ellis?
Yes.
Juan?
Yes.
Jensen?
Yes.
Sukrum?
Yes.
Lejan? Yes. Motion carries 5-0, Mayor.
Now, the planning commission.
Make motion to adjourn.
Second.
First, a second. Landholm,
Yes.
Lathrop,
Yes.
Carlson,
Yeah.
Nielsen,
Yes.
Sawyer,
Yes.
Horace, Jaeger,
Yes.
Warsaw.
Yes.
Motion carries 8-0.
We are adjourned. Have a good night, everybody. Yeah. Thanks, Travis. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. I know that's an issue we'll have to, conversation we're gonna have with utilities.